The Pennsylvania Railroad B8a tank engines were B6 tender engines converted for use as shop switchers. There exist quite a few images and models of these, but not a lot of info. I could not even find out how many were built, though I saw photos of at least 2 unique units with different greebles. The B8 replaces the A6 in my fleet, as I find the former a more visually appealing model with a similar sort of niche. Ever since I discovered the Canadian National X10A, I've kind of had a thing for American tank engines due to their relative rarity and uniqueness. An 060T was very common elsewhere, like in the UK, but very uncommon in the US, especially on the big railroads. I originally avoided building these, quote, smaller, rigid wheelbase locomotives due to the long overhangs at the ends, but having seen the implementation of the C16, I believed I could make it work. I said smaller, but the B8 is actually relatively big. To get a sense of the size, we can compare some other 1-48 engines, my favorite part of scale modeling. Here are the Model 40, the USATC S100, the B8 itself, and the 1912 D2. The length of the 244 barely exceeds that of the 060, an engine with 2 fewer axles. The B8 may even have more volume than the D2, but it has still become my second model to only work with powered up. As far back as the X10, I did not think I could improve my scale modeling much, but my recent experience has somewhat changed my mind. When researching both the Q2 and the B8, I saw some pretty good existing LEGO models, and I wondered if I could do better. In hindsight, I think I did, and I think these two may be my best build to date, all while using fewer retired parts and suspect techniques than before. Furthermore, the B8 still comes apart pretty easily for maintenance. The cab roof connects with 2 studs, and the boiler top with no studs. The battery box also attaches with 2 studs, but I have to pull on the plugs to remove it. Finally, the entire boiler and firebox come off to access the motor. Unfortunately, assembly gets pretty annoying, especially the first time, because the wiring needs to pass under the body and fold into the various crevices. Underneath everything is a very simple drivetrain. 2 gear stages with a net 3 to 5 reduction drive the rear axle, and the connecting rods drive the other axles. I did not reinforce the motor with Technic because stalling the engine does not generate enough torque to overcome the stud connections. The 460-gram locomotive can pull about 180 grams, enough to move 2 9-volt motors and possibly enough to break couplings. This model almost certainly could have accommodated my traditional sliding tile running gear, but I decided to try the pin and rods again to depict the small size of the pistons. This design pushes out the width a bit, but also allows for more detail on and around the cylinders. Like on the Q2, these connect with bars and clips, but they have to have an intermediate stud connection that makes them a bit more fragile. And concerning the elephant in the room, the 10 stud overhang in the back. Having seen a sprung double jointed coupler work reasonably well on the C16, I felt that it could work reasonably well on the B8, even with a longer pitch and even if just for pulling. If it did not work, I could revert to a rigid frame with an R40 compatible front coupling and an R104 compatible back coupling, since R40 compatibility is a slippery slope regardless. I did not find it necessary or desirable to have the entire body pivot, and I only articulated the small bunker. Nonetheless, the model very clearly needs the flexibility on R40 geometry, especially when navigating S-bends. For the spring, I used harder flex tubing rather than the softer rubber hoses because I only wanted the hinge to bend when absolutely necessary. For example, I did not want it to flex when pushing something on a straight track. So after all that, how does it run? The front coupler works normally, as expected, albeit just barely. The back flexes the right way when pulling through curves and remains straight when pushing straight, except with an unduly heavy load. It flexes the wrong way when pushing through curves, but somehow it can still flip over properly when pushing through R40 S-bends, again with a light enough load. I would nonetheless avoid pushing on the pivoting end altogether though. As a tangent, I discovered that the P85s and the open platform car actually don't play well together in R40. Finally, I do have instructions for sale on our rebrickable, though I have to warn that the assembly is very fiddly, as with the Q2. On that note, this is the end of the video. Please consider subscribing if you like what we do, and have a nice day.